Hello, I'm Robert Walker, a volunteer fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is about how there's no risk of nuclear war between Pakistan and India. And the two countries, they've had decades of military skirmishes. The last 2 decades. And they're the clearest example to show that there's no that military skirmishes and even a war between the two. They had an actual war for several months in 1999. And they do not escalate to nuclear war. And what's happening just now is much, much less than any of that. So let's look at that war. The Kargil War of 1999. And there were 30,000 soldiers from India and 5,000 soldiers from Pakistan. Hundreds of them were killed on either side. And Pakistan already had nukes. It had its first subcritical test, and that's much harder to do than an ordinary test in 1983. So it did its first test explosions in 1998 because they wanted to delay them for political reasons. And so by 1999 it was a fully fledged nuclear power with its own nuclear weapons. And of course it didn't even think of using nukes in this situation. It's only the second ever conventional war between nuclear states. The first one was between China and Russia. They both had nukes in 1969, and again, neither of them even considered using nukes. So now, when you get these stories about the Ukraine war, and a drone goes over the border by mistake into Poland, and everyone is talking about, oh, this is going to mean there's going to be a world war, a nuclear war, you can see it's just doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. That NATO and Russia would both have a huge ladder that you've got to climb up, and it's one you go down rather than up. Very much like a fire ladder, you go down it. As soon as there's any incident, both sides are de-escalating. So, no, there's never been a risk of a nuclear war between Russia and Ukraine, and there's no risk whatsoever between India and Pakistan. So, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So, Pakistan's nukes, they're intended for... So Pakistan, in a way, has the lowest threshold of use for nukes in the entire world, although it's still a very, very high threshold and impossible to actually use them. So they would use them in a conventional war, and they would use them if if India invades Pakistan, and they wouldn't use them against any other country. They say, our nukes are only for deterring India. And they're only to prevent an attack by India, not by any other country. Only as a last resort in very extreme situations. If India was to invade with, say, a few 100,000 soldiers or something like that, an overwhelming invasion, then India will only use them to target the Indian soldiers in the battle itself. And India keeps the nukes separate from the launchers, so they can't be launched by mistake. And the Pakistani army is very disciplined and has good control of its nukes. And there's no possibility of terrorists in Pakistan getting hold of the nukes. So India knows all about this, and it's not going to attempt an attack on Pakistan. And India also has a no first use policy for nukes. And so Pakistan's nukes, they are in a way they're the lowest threshold because Russia says it would use nukes in the event of an overwhelming attack that's going to overthrow the Russian Federation. Pakistan would use its nukes in the event of a very large conventional attack, not even in trying to overthrow Pakistan, but to take a very large area of Pakistan. So it's got the lowest threshold of all in the world for using nukes. But India is not going to invade Pakistan, for the very reason that it's got this nuclear deterrent. And basically, it's a cost-saving measure by Pakistan. So Pakistan could have as big an army as India because it's got a very large population. But it would be very expensive to build up such a large army as to be a match for the Indian army. So that's why it has nukes. It's a cost-saving measure. And it's a deterrent like all uses of nukes. So now you've got that background is when Pakistan would use nukes, and India wouldn't do a first use of nukes. So it would have to be Pakistan to start it. And so what you've got here, that gunmen from the Kashmir resistance might have crossed over from Pakistan and killed 26 civilians. Those are not connected with the Pakistani army, they are terrorists. And so that's India's concern is that Pakistan is not doing enough to stop terrorists operating from Pakistan. So India has stopped a water sharing treaty, but it has no practical immediate effects. In this situation, what is the point in Pakistan using nukes? What is it going to stop? Remember, they're used against only military targets. There's nothing military going on here. All that's happened is that India has stopped a water sharing agreement. How is using nukes going to restore a water sharing agreement? That makes no sense whatsoever. So now let's look at this agreement. So what the agreement is that India is in control of 3 rivers, and Pakistan, according to this agreement, is control of 3 other rivers. And Indus, that flows through India, and India's got reservoirs and things there, but Pakistan is in control of how much water flows through that. So these rivers, they're vast. In this time of year, they've got the melting from the Himalayan ice, which melts in the spring, and they've got vast amounts of water. Then they've got the monsoon as well, and they're full of water all the way through to the end of September. And there's no way that India is nothing like a big enough reservoir to stop the water. The water goes flowing all the way down into the river, into the sea, and they just can't hold enough water in all their reservoirs they've got in both India and Pakistan. So there's no way they're going to stop the Indus from flowing down to Pakistan during this wet season. So just bear that in mind. India can't block, especially the Indus. It's a huge river, and India can't block the Pakistan's water at present. So, and this is Hassan Khan saying exactly that. Well, I just explained, they don't have infrastructure in place to store and divert those flows at scale. Basically, India would have to construct an artificial river, taking all that water into dry areas of India. Even then, it would be an extremely difficult, very hard thing to do. So no, they haven't got anything like that. And indeed, if you think about it, they've got all these other rivers they'd have to cross on the way there, if you think about it. So anyway, it's not going to happen. So now we look at Abbasi's threats. So remember this, the water agreement, India can only do something when we get to October, and by then all this will be ancient history, and hopefully they've got over it by now, and they've restored the water agreement. So Abbasi said if they stop the water supply, then they should be ready for war. Well, it's very easy for someone to say that, because they know it's not going to happen. And you get the same sort of thing with Putin and various other people. They make these threats, say if you do this, which I happen to know you're not going to do, then we will use nukes. That's a very common ploy, and it's just a political maneuver when they say that, and it makes very dramatic headlines, and yet they never put in on the spot because the situation is not going to arise. So I mean, it doesn't make sense according to their policy that they'd use nukes in response to India stopping the water supply. And he says that the missiles we have are not for display. Nobody knows where we have placed our nuclear weapons. Well, that's likely true. It's important to realise that the terrorists don't know that either. And the important thing also to know is that they have very careful guard of their nukes. They're kept separate from the missiles, and they make sure they can't be fired by accident. And then they say all of them are targeted at you. Well, that is a little bit of a white lie, really, because what they mean there is just that they are not targeted at any other country, but they wouldn't be targeted at any Indian city, because it's their policy that they would not use their nukes against cities, only against military targets. They'd only use them against military targets in the event of an invasion, so there aren't any targets that they could be targeted at. So that's a bit of a white lie there. And so that's just saber rattling and white lies. And it's specifically are not for use against civilian targets like cities. So it's all similar to Putin. He's just using bluffs for political reasons. And I said they're a great example to show that two nuclear armed neighbours won't use nukes even with frequent military clashes every year, even with people dying on both sides, and civilians as well as soldiers. So one of the worst days was in 2020 when 6 civilians and 3 soldiers and a border guard died on the Indian side, 4 civilians, 1 soldier and 22 others wounded on the Pakistan side in just one day in 2020. And before that there were 2 airstrikes in 2019, so I want to talk about this a little bit. So I was fact checking back then. If you go back and look in the group back to 2019, you'll find that you'll find people worrying about this and getting scared because Pakistan shot down this Indian MiG-21 fighter jet. But the pilot he escaped unharmed, and actually the only deaths there were friendly fire from India. So India accidentally shot down its own helicopter in this dogfight. And this gives you an idea. These are not very experienced armies on either side. They have not been involved in actual warfare. They just do exercises. And so there's this anti-skirmishes. They're not involved in the sort of warfare that would have meant they were experiencing this sort of thing. And so in the 2019 incident that this is all about, India actually missed all 3 targets. And what they use glide bombs, and you know the glide bombs that Russia uses every day in Ukraine, and that Israel was using every day in the Gaza Strip, and they also use them against other targets. And then they can glide for tens of kilometers. Well, and Ukraine uses them sometimes too. Well, for an army that's used to using them, they're very precise. But because they're glide bombs, they use GPS to identify their target, but you've got to get not just the horizontal the 2-dimensional coordinates. You've got to get the height right as well, which is a thing that you never even get stories about this with Israel or Ukraine because they're so familiar, or Russia because they're so familiar to using them. But India wasn't used to using them, and it seems that they likely programmed them by mistake to fly 33 meters above the target. So the glide bombs would have flown over these buildings, and then once they got past their target, then the onboard controls would say, well, we should have hit our target by now, and they just all fell in various places in the forest. So that's what happened there. Or they could have just kept gliding down until they hit the ground. But either way, for whatever reason, that's what happened. So we talk about not very experienced armies here. And we've got 2 examples of that. We've got India shooting down its own helicopter and their glide bombs missing their targets. So they're not... So we're talking about armies that do skirmishes, and they are not really prepared for a modern war anyway. And so Pakistan, and then there's, just to talk about that, that's not very important. What is this about? Well, that's about why they developed their battlefield nukes. India is not going to, the whole point in this policy is India would know the consequences of such an attack and so wouldn't do it. That's my summary. And India is committed to no first use of nukes and no use of nukes against non-nuclear countries. And India is one of the countries that's most vociferous about trying to prohibit all nukes, trying to end towards universal nuclear disarmament. It's not surprising it's got nukes, but it's got 2 nuclear neighbours. Well, it's got China as a nuclear neighbour, and then Pakistan got its nukes after India, I think. But it's not too surprising that India has its nukes, but it's committed to no first use. So that's why I said that it would have to be Pakistan. Pakistan obviously wouldn't use them either. And I said Pakistan only permits the first use against an overwhelming attack. And India, it's every year it puts forward 2 annual resolutions. One is that it calls for negotiations on a universal and binding convention prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons by any country. Another is on reducing nuclear danger. So, as I say, it's one of the most vociferous countries in that respect, doing that every year. And it also tries to educate other countries and people from other countries into the dangers of nuclear weapons and ending nukes. So we've got one of the countries that is most against nukes, of the nuclear powers, that most wants to get rid of them, and then we've got another country that wouldn't use them against civilian targets. So these are the 2 countries that are involved here. And then there's this idea that people have. I just want to talk about this. Very bizarre idea to my mind. And this happens in war games. It wouldn't happen in real life. So the claim is that if one country uses nukes, then you've got this mysterious nuclear threshold, and people say, that country used nukes, so we can't too. And then everyone in the world starts using nukes. That makes no sense whatsoever. Utterly no sense. So if you try and think about the real world, rather than people playing with bits of paper on a table in a war game or a computer program or something, if you've got a real nuclear war, then if there was anything like Hiroshima happened again, ever in the modern world, then you'd have it streaming video on the internet, and we now know how to treat these victims. So the world's very best burn specialists and the very best experts on radiation sickness would all be converging on the area. It doesn't matter if they're soldiers or if they're civilians. We've got large numbers of people who've got very complex, very difficult injuries to deal with. Then you're going to have the best doctors and nurses in the world who know about this. India and Pakistan would be calling out for them. If you imagine it was just, this is not going to happen because of this huge threshold effect, that they're just not going to do it. But you imagine this impossible scenario where, say, India decided for totally bizarre, impossible reasons to invade Pakistan with, say, 100,000 soldiers. And then Pakistan fires a Hiroshima-sized nuke at them, and tens of thousands of them die, and tens of thousands will get radiation sickness before they can get into shelter. Then imagine a situation like that. Then the other way around, Pakistan, before Pakistan used a nuke against India used a nuke against a Pakistan city, in say, or something like that, or has some effect on civilians rather than against military. But I think it used it against a military target too. I can't really see India using it against, but just suppose it affected civilians badly as well. So we've got this worst case scenario. Then are they going to keep on using nukes against each other? No, that doesn't make sense. Everybody will stop and take stock of that situation. And then in that situation, then it'd be the focus, the biggest humanitarian mission, that the relief operation the world has ever mounted. And experts from around the world, there wouldn't be enough experts in Pakistan and India combined to treat all the victims. Not with the complex injuries they'd have. So you'd have the world's biggest humanitarian relief operation. The news would be full of it. There'd be video streaming over and over and over and over again about all the events that happened during the exchange. So in that situation, are the Indian civilians going to be saying to India, drop more nukes on Pakistan? Are the Pakistan civilians going to be saying to Pakistan, drop more nukes on India? Is Russia or the UK or United States, are they going to, or is Israel, are they going to say, oh well, we've crossed the nuclear threshold, let's start dropping nukes on everyone, and China? It makes no sense whatsoever. Can you see that? It simply makes no sense. It would be in the opposite direction. It would lead to more and more countries wanting to give up their nukes altogether. Probably India and Pakistan would both give up their nukes after that. And then other countries would also want to do that too. And it would be big calls on all the countries in the world to give up their nukes. Because citizens will be saying, well look, nukes don't work, they don't stop wars. The only reason that these civilians support governments to have nukes is because they stop wars. That's what they believe. So I think it's highly unlikely that NATO and that the Soviet Union and NATO would have fought each other, even if neither side had nukes. Even if nukes were physically impossible. I think that there might have been some military clashes of some sort, a little bit like skirmishes between Pakistan and India. I think that would have been it. But some people, so many people think that because both sides are nukes, that has kept peace. And I think it is possible it stopped skirmishes. So anyway, whatever you think about that, then the whole idea of nuclear is a deterrent. It is not the idea that you'd use them, and nobody even remotely sane would say that you should use nukes. And leaders do not suddenly go extremely insane. And the various precautions, just that very remote case, I couldn't find any example of a modern leader who's gone insane in that sense. I had to go back to an English king who did it very gradually and probably had bipolar disorder over a period of time. So anyway, so the but of course you wouldn't want someone with bipolar disorder in the manic phase in charge of nuclear weapons. So but there's many precautions to stop something like that. So this is Africa, and this is to show all the countries that have actually ratified the African treaty, the Nuclear Free Africa Treaty. The other ones they have signed but not ratified, and the important thing is, of course, that none of these are nuclear powers anyway, and none of these are even going to consider developing nukes. And so then if you've got the entire African nuclear-free zone, you've got entire South America, you've got Mexico, Australia, Philippines, you've got Mongolia, and a large nuclear-free zone there, nuclear weapon-free zone there. All the blue states, just about the entire southern hemisphere, apart from a bit of India and a little bit there. Then almost the entire southern hemisphere is nuclear-free zone already, and in some quite large parts of the northern hemisphere. And then you go to the countries that want to prohibit all nukes, and remember that India is very strongly in favour of this, but it doesn't feel safe enough to give up its own nukes. That's essentially the situation. And so we need to have a kind of big change before we actually prohibit nukes globally. I think it will happen at some time, but we're not really at that stage yet. But these are all the countries that have. So that includes many countries like, for instance, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, South America, South Africa, Mexico. Many countries have Mongolia. Many countries are signatories of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This means that they're not going to develop nukes, and they're not going to let anyone station nukes where they are. They're not going to be in any nuclear umbrella with any other country, and none of the nuclear powers have joined this yet, but quite a large number, a total of 93 states have signed it and 73 have ratified it. So I'll just talk a little bit about Jeremy Corbyn, former Labour Party leader. He said that if elected as Prime Minister he would never use nuclear weapons. And then, do I mention Scotland? Yes, here in the UK, SNP party in Scotland, which is where I live, then if Scotland ever becomes independent, then it's going to give up its nukes. And that's the reason that's the main reason that I have for voting for an independent Scotland, is because it'll give up its nukes if it leaves the United Kingdom. And the Green Party in England, they also vote, they have an anti-nuclear weapons. So, but the only reason that the United Kingdom, the only reason any country has nukes is because they're not going to be used. And if there was any thought that it really, really would use them, then the civilians wouldn't accept that as a possibility. Just doesn't compute to have nukes if you think you're going to use them and they're going to be used. So now I just want to talk about nuclear, and then I've talked about that in my bigger debunk. So you've probably heard this already. If not, go and look at my debunk, which I'll link to at the end. And that is about, sorry, I got a bit distracted there. I better finish my train of thought while I said it. So we know that nobody in the, that none of the governments in Europe, none of them actually believe that there's a real risk of a nuclear war, because if there was, they would be telling us all how to protect ourselves against fallout. You can save millions of lives if you know what to do. The reason that so many people died after the war so with Hiroshima, tens of thousands of people died much later. And the reason for that is they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to protect themselves from fallout. They just ran out of their houses into the dust. And they saw the black dust falling out of the black rain falling out of the sky and the dust, and they didn't think that they need to be protected from it. So the one thing you need to know, you don't need to know because it's not going to happen, but the one thing that you would be told if there was any risk of fallout, is the risk of a nuclear war, is that if you see a mushroom cloud, or if you see, then get indoors before the dust starts falling out of the sky. Easily obvious, visible dust. Get as far away from it as you can, and that would save millions of lives. In a nuclear war, we're not told this, and from that it's very clear that our governments, it's on the website, you can find the information easily enough, but they aren't running it every day on the news like they would if there was a risk of nuclear fallout. So they clearly don't believe there's a risk of a nuclear war. And as I say, the threshold is far, far higher than for Pakistan and for India. So hopefully talking about Pakistan and India will help people who are scared about it in other areas to realise it's just not going to happen. Just not even remotely possible. Now, I just want to talk about this idea of nuclear winter. And the idea of nuclear winter, Carl Sagan had it originally, and another researcher in the 60s or 70s, I think it was 1970s paper, I can't remember now. Anyway, there were always people who were very sceptical at the beginning. I don't think that, it's not that Carl Sagan made it up. So he believed it sincerely, but perhaps he would allowed himself to just kind of somewhat fudge the data but not meaning to, because he was very anti-nukes. So he then predicted when there was the fight between Iraq and Kuwait, and the Kuwaiti oil fires which were set on fire, and it took a long, long time to put them out. It was set on fire when the Iraq army was retreating after the war. And when those were set on fire, it took a long time to put them out. You got very hot, intense fires with smoke going high up into the atmosphere. And Carl Sagan said this is going to lead to a cooling of large areas of the Middle East, because he believed his nuclear winter hypothesis. And nothing like that happened. So after that, Carl Sagan realized that his very early, rather primitive model wasn't correct, and that there wouldn't be a nuclear winter after nuclear war. So then there's still some researchers though that they take Carl Sagan's model, but they started when the soot is already very high up in the atmosphere. And what happened with the Q80 oil fires is that the black smoke, and it never got above the weather. So that's what Carl Sagan got wrong. They just weren't strong enough updrafts. So the whole point is, it's not the mushroom cloud. The mushroom cloud does get into the very high atmosphere above the weather if you've got a very big enough nuclear explosion, not for a small one, but for a big one. And when it gets above the weather, though, it's full of very heavy dust. Most of it falls out, and there's not really very much left after that. And you get a cloud that gets dispersed, and within a few tens of minutes, the whole cloud is just dispersed and it's gone. So it's not the mushroom cloud. That's not going to cause anything like a nuclear winter. Not anything like enough dust gets up high enough and stays up high enough for long enough. There is some fine dust there, which spreads out throughout Earth, and just little bits of dust falls down, but it's far too little to be anything like a nuclear winter, or any kind of winter, or nuclear autumn, or anything. So it's not the mushroom clouds, it's the fires that happen after that. And then you just stop and think about the wildfires we have every year. So I could expand a bit on that in my debunk here. So we have the fires in Australia. We have the famous fires in Australia and in California. California used to have much larger fires. First of all, there were larger fires when they were managed by the first peoples. And there were even larger fires before humans even got there. And none of those led to anything like nuclear winter. For the same reason, the smoke just doesn't go high enough, and it all rains out within a few days to weeks. We have the big fires during the large areas, when large areas of the Amazon were being deforested, and those fires didn't start anything like a nuclear winter. We had the Dresden fire, which is a fire in a city, nothing like it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nothing like it. So this is based on no evidence. And all the evidence goes against it, this idea of nuclear winter. And so this researcher Roebuck, he said, well, look, I think I've got an exception to all this. What about the Indian and Pakistani cities? They can be very flammable, and they would start up a more intense fire. So most cities, then in most cities, especially like in European cities, you've got a lot of fire-resistant materials, you've got lots of rubble, and you've got lots of brick and stone and things like that as well, which would lead to a lot of rubble. And that means that it's actually less flammable than a forest, if anything. But if you go to some Indian cities and Pakistani cities, then they might be more flammable than a forest. So that then leads to the idea, could you get something that is worse than a wildfire? And so that is what Meissner and his team looked at. So he tried to model this firestorm, and he made it as bad as he possibly could. He was trying to get the soot up into the atmosphere. So first of all, it's an implausible scenario, because Pakistan and India have nukes to prevent war, just like everyone does. It's specific to the highly flammable and hot Pakistani cities and Indian cities, and not the colder parts of Pakistan, the hotter parts, of course. And it's only it wouldn't work in the winter, it wouldn't work in the monsoon season. The winter is December to February, and monsoon season is May to September. So it wouldn't work in either of those seasons. It wouldn't work very well in the post-monsoon season, which is October to November, and it wouldn't work when there's a strong wind, and that part of India and Pakistan gets strong winds in May. In May, have I got that right? And yeah, let's get these figures right. So where did I get it? June to September is the monsoon season, November to February is the winter. And I was getting a bit mixed up with the when the Indus River is more water there, but this is a different thing, because that's because of the melting of the ice in the Himalayas. It's not the same as the monsoon season. So you've got the monsoon season, June to September, most of the post-monsoon, October to November. Then during that time, you've got lots of water and lots of rain and lots of clouds, and it's not, and that will, all the soot would drain out very quickly and be difficult to get a fire going. And then you've got the low winds in May to June, and those strong winds make it difficult for the fire to burn to its optimals. It burns much less intensely if you've got a very strong wind, like gusts of wind. And then you've got the winter from November to February. So that gets you to just 2 months, just the 2 months of March and April. And if you then set it up with, you've got to make lots of decisions when you're making a model, because you can't model everything. It just gets too complicated. So they made all the decisions in favour of getting as much soot as possible into the upper atmosphere, and leaving out things that might well reduce the amount of soot that gets up there. And they found that there would be a fraction of a degree cooling, mostly in the Arctic region, after assuming 100 exchange of 100 nukes. And that's the Arctic region. You can see that Australia only cools by 0.2, less than 0.2 degrees centigrade, and most of the area, most of the region is hardly at all. The larger effects are in the colder areas, where you have much larger differences between summer and winter. So where I am in Scotland, we're not going to much notice a difference of an extra half a degree of coldness in winter and a slightly cooler summer. It's very variable weather anyway in temperate climate like this. And you're not going to start getting crops failing, you're not going to start getting human animals going extinct and plants going extinct and all these dire scenarios that they claim for nuclear winter. None of that's going to happen. It doesn't make sense. So this is only a fraction of degree cooling. It's most of it is within the year-to-year variation. It's not even a nuclear winter, and it wouldn't even reverse the effects of global warming. Nothing like, even in the Arctic, where there's the strongest effect. So you can hardly call that a nuclear winter or nuclear. It's not a nuclear autumn. It's nothing. It's literally, you would have to be pretty geeky to notice it in a way. Might be some, would be some effects that people would notice, but they wouldn't know it was caused by this. It would just seem like a rather colder year or something, slightly colder year or winter or summer for their part of the world, but just within the normal variation. So, and then remember that they assume that both sides target cities, and Pakistan's policy to use their nukes only against military targets, and European cities would be much less affected. You can't really apply this to Europe because that would just be like normal wildfires. It just wouldn't work. So it's specific to this scenario, and that's why there's so much focus on this, because it's the only place in the world where there are conditions that seem somewhat favourable for something remotely resembling a nuclear winter, and it's not even the slightest bit like it. And so they keep talking about it, but really that doesn't really count as nuclear winter. So I hope that helps some of you, or even a nuclear autumn. And so I hope that helps some of you who got scared about nuclear winter. And then if you're worried about fallout, then just go to the how we don't risk a world war from Ukraine, Middle East, China, North Korea, or indeed Pakistan, India. I don't think I'm not sure if I cover it there, but I should put in a section about Pakistan. I should basically copy part of this over into that longer debunk. Then that'd be worth doing, because I think it's a bit of an omission. I didn't really go into detail anyway. If I do cover it, I can't remember if I do. So that's that. So I just go through all these scenarios, and it just I do cover China. Do I cover India? I just pick it up. Let's see if I cover India. No, look at the wrong one. I don't seem to have covered. Yeah, I don't seem to have done a section about India. It just wasn't. People just weren't scared about it at the time I was writing that. So yeah, so I'll add a section about India, but this video suffices for that. You can see I can add that to it. So if you're worried about any of the other areas like Ukraine, the Middle East, China, North Korea, then go and look at that. And I talk about all those separately. And I'll add a section about India and Pakistan, which is just basically what I've just said now. And I have a video introduction which talks about what I said a bit earlier in this video, that we know that. So first of all, we've got this whole threshold thing that it really will help there in that longer debunk. It'll explain how this whole threshold thing, it just doesn't make sense. I have a bit about that, and this could explain it. I could underline that point. And then this whole thing about the government's clearly back in the Cold War. We all knew what to do about fallout, and they don't anymore. It's all on the websites. They don't bother to try and tell us because they know full well that there isn't any real risk at all. Isn't it? We just don't risk a nuclear war or world war. So anyway, hopefully this helps you to be much less scared about this. And the reason I've been through just so many wars myself, lived through, not in them, nowhere near me, other parts of the world. So the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Falklands War, the Vietnam War when I was somewhat younger, I was still going on. The invasion of Libya. I've got several more I could add to that. The Yugoslav wars were going on when I was living during the Cold War, and many wars in the Middle East. It just, we do get wars all the time, but we are headed, I think, towards a world without war. And I look at Hans Blix, who was, I've got this thing up here. Yeah, let's just quickly go to that. So I don't need to add it to the debunk because it's here already. But if we go down here, let's just end this video with that, even though it's not in the debunk. So yes, I'll end that with that. It's a good way to end. So meanwhile, most of us are at peace. So most of the world is at peace. Even most of Ukraine is at peace. So I know we do get these. I wrote that back then when there was the airstrikes were protected by the Patriot air defences, and now we are getting our air sirens in most of Ukraine. But but people get into their shelters for the air sirens, and very few people actually die from the attacks on the Ukrainian civilian cities. So it is a scary time for people, but it's not continued very much as they did in peace, and there's a peaceful situation there. And then it's very much there's always the back of your mind that you could be killed, but actually your personal risk is higher from traffic accidents, really, in most of Ukraine. And then for health of mind, it's good to focus on how, as the Dalai Lama put it, like this, love and compassion predominate in the world. And that's why the implicit defense are news. Because compassionate activities are so much part of daily life, they're taken for granted and therefore largely ignored. So it's good to try and notice that in your daily life. Try actually, and you can actually try and do something. Try and, for instance, help with crisis in Ukraine. I'm talking about humanitarian crises there. So this is suitable for a pacifist to do. I gave small amounts to for both Gaza Strip and Ukraine. You can do something. It's a way of just being engaged. You're not going to make a significant difference, but you are involved in the process of helping these people who are being harmed in one way or another by war. You can just do it as a kind of token, not an amount that would be difficult for you to find, but a way to be engaged and feel that you're doing something. And helping people who are scared, like we're doing in the Doomsday Debunked group. And then remember that we can rebuild after wars. So, and it's remarkable what they're doing already, and that's the rebuilding. So that is the firebombing of Dresden, which I talked about, which is that's the one that didn't produce anything even remotely like the cooling effect of a nuclear winter. And there was nothing to suggest that a firebombing, which is exactly pretty much, it's actually worse than what you'd get from a nuclear weapon in some ways, because it's actually designed to set up fires throughout a city. That didn't cause anything like that. That's it rebuilt. That is that building rebuilt. And there's another example. That's in Warsaw and rebuilt. So, and then if you, every time you visit somewhere like Athens, you can see Athens of ancient Greek, you can see a few ruins left from centuries ago. And so just think, all our cities are constantly being rebuilt. So, and then this is the rebuilding. Ukraine is already rebuilding. This is much more has happened since then. Rebuilt bridges, Bucha, or Bucha, however you say it. Then that's the same street. That's the street under the Russians. It's the street as it is now. So that was under warfare. That's as it is now. So it's remarkable how quickly after a war that it can return to looking just like an ordinary place, and it's back to peace. Essentially peace. There's no war, there's no bombing on the streets, there's very little shelling in most of, no shelling, which causes all this very severe disruption, and very little effects from the very few areas that are actually affected by. You can look at one of my debunks has I share a video which does a someone shared that I follow. It's got a skyline view of Ukraine, of Kiev, and you can see how most of it is. You don't see scars of war there. There are scars of war, but they're very small compared to the entire city. So please don't get this idea you get from the media that all of Ukraine is somehow ruins or something like that. It is a country going on largely at peace outside of the normal peaceful activities, with sadly air raid sirens from time to time. That's the life of most of Ukraine. And outside of Ukraine, you don't get the air raid sirens, and there's no risk of a missile attacking falling on you, no matter where you are outside Ukraine. Except if you're in the very border regions of Poland and Romania, very remote chance that some stray missile from the war not aimed at you would fly over and might crash somewhere. There's a slight chance, and that's it. And so you shouldn't blame, and this is one of the things that the Dalai Lama said. So I'm a Buddhist, so he's in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, same tradition as me, and but the things he says are not just for Buddhists, they're for everyone. And so he talks about how you can't blame or generalize the whole of Islam. Islam's like any other religion. The essence is a message of love and forgiveness. The very word jihad is about combating your own destructive emotion, not harming others. That's what a genuine Islamic practitioner is all about. And if a Muslim creates bloodshed, they're no longer an Islamic practitioner, sincere practitioner. So that's the Dalai Lama. He talks a lot to people of other religions, and listening and understanding how their religion goes. It's a tradition in Tibetan Buddhism called Rime, which is about sharing sharing how your different religions work without trying to adopt or mix them together in any way. Indeed, being careful to keep them separate so the different traditions don't get mixed up with each other, which can cause all sorts of confusion, but learning about each other and understanding each other. And the Dalai Lama exemplifies that. So it's not bad to be a Russian, it's not bad to be Indian, it's not bad to be a Pakistani, it's not bad to be a Muslim, it's not bad to be a Christian, it's not bad to be a Jew. So please remember that. You have a few mischievous people. It's not bad to be communist. It's not bad to be any of these isms. And the Russians can be proud of their Russian tradition. and uphold what is surely good in their culture. And then our path to a fully civilized species, we're surely not civilized for as long as we have war. And we're headed towards more, not less, civilization. And that's one of the things that Carl Sagan thought about it the same way, that we are headed, the same person as for the nuclear winter idea, but he thinks that we're headed towards more, not less, civilization. And our generation's children want a future of peace. And this is from the not nearly so much attention, the conflicts in Yemen that barely hit hit the news, and some poems by children who are saying, what if peace was a pandemic? What if everyone come close to everyone to spread love? And with peace we can get through any conflict. With peace, no bad dreams, no hatred. Let's build peace, let's make peace. And this is a kid who's been caught up in war. And this is about finding peace, and this is from the All on the Board Companion, Inspiring Messages from the London Underground by Ian Redpath and Jeremy Chopra. Peace on earth for us all would be a wonderful thing. I hope we can have it one day, and I believe we can, because if anything is possible, then why not world peace? We don't have to give up on trying to make it so, just because someone says it's unrealistic. They said that about airplanes once, and I can't tell you how many people said Ian and I wouldn't make the All on the Board get to 100 followers, so that's him talking about himself. And he talks about how you can find peace everywhere, in so many different places, and then we have a purpose to make this world a peaceful place for those here now and those who inherit it once we're gone. And I came after the so this is Heinz Blix. I've left Heinz Blix. That's further back. I forgot about that. So Heinz Blix, A Farewell to Wars. So he is a former nuclear weapons inspector, former head of the IAEA, and chair of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission. And so he says we're headed for a world without wars. Someone who actually does weapon inspecting for nuclear weapons. And he thinks that Russia's attack on Ukraine may well prove to be the last ever war for territorial gain. Well, and the Gaza Strip war, he actually looks at that too. But in the traditional sense, comprising the seizing of land and changing borders by force, he says they're on the way out. Now, something that I thought about recently is that actually the two wars that I saw in the news today, they were both mistakes. So Putin decided to invade Ukraine in spring 2021. And if he'd understood the situation in Ukraine as well as he does today, he would not have invaded Ukraine. So he believed that his army would be welcomed by people throwing flowers on the tanks. He expected the Ukrainian generals to switch over to the Russian side as soon as the tanks started entering Ukraine. He thought that he could set up a land bridge with a hospital airport, which is not far out of Kiev, and then they would just quickly take over this airport, drive into Kiev, and they'd take over the government. And he expected that either Zelensky would flee from there, or else he'd kill him, or he'd be captured and imprisoned, and then set up a friendly regime in Kiev. And he expected all that to happen in the first couple of weeks, and he expected to take over Kiev in the first couple of days. So that was the mistake that Putin made. He expected to be a bit like Belarus, and but Belarus is and become something like Belarus, a subsidiary state, but actually easier than that. He thought he thought it'd be like Crimea, which is really quite easily done, and he thought he'd learned from Crimea, and he'd found a way to do it even more easily and take over all of Ukraine very quickly. And his mistake is that he's a spy, and he knows all about spying. He doesn't know about military action, and didn't run this past a competent general. And he didn't do the most basic thing, which is red and blue teaming, which is you say, I set up my team, and then what happens if the other team gets some people to play act the other team to try and stop me? What happens if they actually do their very best to stop me. Will my plans succeed in that case? And Putin didn't try that. He just said, if they behave exactly as I hope they will behave, this is what will happen, and I'll take over all of Ukraine in a couple of weeks, and I'm not going to bother to try and play out what would happen if they were to try to stop me in a different way from the way that I expected them to respond. And no military general would do that. So it just shows how naive and inexperienced he is in military matters, and only used to using the Russian army against much weaker countries. So that's why Russia invaded Ukraine, because Putin made this mistake. He would never make this mistake against NATO. And he's extremely cautious, very careful. He doesn't do things unless he's, as I said, he'd been thinking about this. He sent spies into Ukraine to gather data for him, which told him a very rosy picture. They said that the Ukrainians are very dissatisfied with their government and they will rise up and they will help you. And it was complete fabrication. So the spies were telling Putin what he wanted to hear, because that's one of the things about being a dictator. People are afraid to tell you anything different from what you're expecting. And so that's the mistake that Putin made. So that was a mistake. And same with the Gaza Strip. Then Netanyahu, he withdrew his, he ignored warnings from the border guards saying that the Hamas were doing these exercises just across the border within visual sight, where they were practicing with the mock Israeli buildings and practicing in attacking them. And he was told that, and he just didn't, or it didn't get to him, or he didn't pay any attention to him. We knew those reports were there. And he withdrew the border guard to look after the West Bank. So that was a big mistake that Netanyahu made. If he hadn't made that mistake, the entire Gaza war wouldn't have happened. Though there were some positive things happened out of that, like for instance the Syria. So if he hadn't done that, Assad would still be the dictator in Syria, because it's a knock-on effect of the effect on Hezbollah, the effect of Gaza Strip, the effect on Hezbollah, and then that led to the Syria almost without force taking over Syria and ending the Assad regime. So that has ended. So, but all that wouldn't have happened. All of that are due to these two mistakes by Putin and Netanyahu. So we're headed for a future without wars. And I thought that the actual two exceptions we have to that, of the direction towards less and less of territorial wars, they're both mistakes. So I thought that was an interesting, neat little tie-in. So Hans Blix, he thinks that these are blips, and he sees this as and the public mind will continue to be the greatest importance for what sort of forms of come. So the public mind, all of the public mind, that's he talks about how it helped to abolish the slave trade, and it's led to successful public campaigns against cruel and indiscriminate weapons, and it was the force that stood behind the first legal ban on the use of force between states, and all that, he says, is gradually moving us forward to this future where we're not going to have wars at all. And there are many things we can do to help. And I've looked here about how you can see we're moving in the direction of far less conflict between the great powers, and much larger areas that have got security community like NATO, and got negative peace and very little by way of severe rivalry happening compared to the past. So we can see the direction that it's going, and the direction that's going. And we're moving in the direction of World War, and indeed ending warfare altogether. We do have more smaller wars, but our small wars much less effect on civilians now. Even in the Ukraine war, there's apart from Mariupol, which was a really very sad event, But apart from that, the far more effect on, and of course things like the forcible adoption of Ukrainian kids, but generally it's an interaction of much less by way of civilians affected in warfare. Our weapons are far more precise than they were through the Yugoslav wars, for instance, and far less effective, far less civilians are killed. So we are moving in the direction of smaller, more precise wars with less effect on civilians, much less tendency of great powers to come together, much larger areas that are in security arrangements of some sort, like NATO, or a kind of passive peace. And there's and Hans Blix, looking at this, and someone who's very experienced, weapon inspector, he sees this path as leading towards eventually no war whatsoever. And what's more, eventually leading to scrapping of the big missiles, stores of missiles we have as well. You know, all the ballistic missiles and the fighter jets and so on. There's likely going to be a future, maybe not too many. I don't think I'm going to live to it. I'm 70, and you know, even if I live to 100, I doubt if I'll reach the world where there's literally no missiles left. But we're headed that way, and that's when we'll eventually become a fully civilized. I think we could see an end in my lifetime to major wars of territory, and trying to gain territory. The territories eventually become stable and only change through political methods, like countries seeking independence. Like, for instance, in Ukraine, Crimea could become a completely independent country at some point, independent of both Russia and Ukraine. There's no sign of that at the moment. They want to be part of Ukraine. Well, Russia says they want to be part of Russia, but many Ukrainians say that the people there want to be part of Ukraine rather than an independent country. But that's the sort of thing. You get political changes rather than military changes. And this is for Russia. Not everyone agrees that they should change their flag, but it's a flag that has been used as a symbol. I've got it on my avatar, the flag of the wonderful Russia of the future, which is showing that we're not talking about anything against the people of Russia. That the people, they've got a great culture, a wonderful country, and some Russians think that they need a new flag with white, blue, and white. A peaceful and free Russia, but others say that they should use a different shade of blue in order to the shade of blue that was used after the breakup of the Soviet Union and before the rising of Putin. Putin is just temporary. He's not going to live forever, and his regime may not last. His regime may not last his entire lifetime either. So this is as I say. So where most of us are at peace, most of the world is at peace. The damage of war can be mended, and it's only a few mischievous people. It's not the fault of any group of people, and we're on the path to a civilized, towards more, not less civilization, and we're not yet fully civilized. As long as we have wars and kill people, we can of course have competition like the sports, like the Olympics and so on, and peaceful competitive ways of dealing with things. But actually killing people just doesn't make sense as a civilized way of dealing with situations. And as we become more civilized, surely we find an end to wars. And so we can achieve this. It's within our reach. And I think some of the younger ones that I'm that listening to this, you may well, when you're a few decades from now, we may see a world that is almost entirely peace, just peace, with no wars anymore. I think that's in our future, and I think that we'll be very close to it. We get very close to it this century. I see so many signs of this. So much of us working together to solve problems, and the more powerful countries helping the weaker countries in more and more ways. And so that's what I see as the future. Anyway, so if any of you got any questions, I'll put a link to these. I'll put a link to both of these articles in the video description. The India and Pakistan one, and this one about the how we don't risk a world war, and we're headed towards peace. So I'll put both of those in the video description, and if you go to the end of these, then I've got a whole lot of links for our Doomsday Clump, to the Doomsday Debunked Facebook group, and various resources to help you and so on, if you get easily scared. So anyway, that's it, and hopefully that helps some of you be a little bit less scared, and I'll upload this to my YouTube channel.